Hello everyone and welcome back to Bitwig Studio and Music Production. This is lesson 5.63, and in this lesson we're going to discover FM synthesis the exact same way John Chowning first discovered it in the late 1960s. Before going any further in this video, I encourage you guys, in fact I require you guys if you're watching this video, to pause my video to go into the description and find a link to this particular YouTube clip called John Chowning Origins of FM Synthesis. How there are only 7,000 views, I have no idea, but anyone who's interested in FM synthesis, watch that video, really listen to what he's saying, and once you finish that video, come back here to our lesson, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to have us discover FM the exact same way John Chowning discovered it in the late 60s. All right, so I'm assuming you've paused my video, you've watched that one. If you were a little confused about what he was saying, don't worry, because we're going to recreate it here so we can actually listen to what's going on, specifically to the frequency spectrum. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is set up an oscillator. Okay, so I'm going to use number 1 as my oscillator. And I'm just going to double click this and set it to 220 because I know 220 is an A note. All right, so now if I press a key on the keyboard, doesn't matter what the key is, this is like a fixed mode right here. The bottom one is fixed, meaning that no matter what key I press, we are not going to be key tracking, and that's very important for when you're designing your patches. But if I play this, we can see this is falling at 220 at an A. We're getting a few overtones here because Bitwig doesn't have a perfect sine wave here. That's fine, it's not going to screw up what's going on. And in fact, in the early days when Chowning was discovering this, those tone generators, they were definitely not perfect either. So this is probably similar to what, if they had a frequency spectrum like this at the time, what they would have seen. Okay, so now what I need to do is I need to set up an LFO. I have an LFO over here, but I want to set this up a little bit more organically. And I'm going to use this second oscillator as my LFO. What I need to do to activate this as a modulator is I have to turn this on. I have to turn up my modulation. Okay, so now this is acting as a modulator, but it doesn't know what it's modulating yet. We have to set that up in the matrix here. This isn't super important, but basically going across is oscillator 1. So this is going from left to right. So if I was to turn up 2, this would say oscillator 2 is modulating oscillator 1. If I turn up 3, that's saying that oscillator 3 is now modulating oscillator 1. If I was to turn on oscillator 4, etc., etc., etc. And now with number 2 here, we kind of are at a stage where this is acting as an operator. But for now, I want to just think of this as a modulator in its most basic state. So I'm just going to go ahead and turn that up to 100%. And it's currently working, but it's working at 0.00 hertz. So we're not going to really hear anything. So let's start to turn this up. And now we're starting to hear that classic vibrato effect that John Chowning was talking about. But as we approach and breach the sub-audio level, sub-audio hertz being up to 20 hertz, something really crazy is going to happen, and we're going to see that here on the spectrum, and I'll talk about it as we go up. Just watch that waveform changing. So we can even start to see new harmonics are starting to pop up here, and these are called sidebands. So now we've breached what we could do with our LFO. We're up to 55.6 hertz and still climbing. Now, when he was doing this, he said it was an ear discovery, and as he started to pull up the frequency on the modulator, he started to think, wait, this is sounding like harmonics. There sounds like there's a natural order to this, especially when I approach these even logical ratios. And so this FM whole business is going back to some of our very first lessons where we talked about, you know, the length of strings vibrating and even in odd ordered harmonics. It's all coming back full circle right now as we talk about FM synthesis. And listen to what happens as I start to approach 110 hertz. And remember what we talked about with beating before. You can hear that beating occurring. In order to get this perfect, because there's 3 decimal places, I'm going to double click it. I'm just going to type in 110, so it's going to lock it in. And listen to that. Perfect. It just completely snaps in. And so we can see what's happening here with our frequency spectrum. And these are falling at very logical locations, okay? We have our A, another A, our E, perfect fifth. We have another A, a C sharp, an E, a G, an A, a B, etc., 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 following just in line with what we've talked about harmonics from the very beginning. All right, what I could do is I could also set this at 220, so that 220 is actually modulating that initial sine wave of 220. And let's see and listen to what this sounds like. Now this should look and sound very familiar to you, and it should look and sound a little bit like a sawtooth wave. And what's the reason for that? Well, let me explain it to you, and let's think about what I talked about with analog distortion. I said when we cross that 0 point, that energy has to be brought back into the signal. And it's going to impact the frequency spectrum of that signal. If it's just a sine wave and we've breached and we're using tube distortion, it's going to introduce in new harmonics at logical locations, at even and odd ordered locations in the frequency spectrum. And it's the exact same thing here. We start with a sine wave, and now we're putting all this extra energy on that sine wave at 220 hertz at its fundamental. And so obviously it's going to produce a similar sort of frequency spectrum that follows along with the natural order of harmonics and vibrating strings and the ratios that we've talked about. And that's really the basis of FM synthesis. Chowning realized that you could go to these different locations, and based on the ratios that you set up between your modulator and your carrier, aka the audible oscillator and the modulator, that determined the sidebands that were going to be generated. So we could put in here like a completely random number. Let's use 397 and listen to this. Not super pleasant, and compare it to 440, right? So we have a, in this case, let's say this is like the 1 to 2 ratio. That sounds very, very nice. Or we could go 110. So now we're saying 2 to 1. And in the case of this synthesizer, for some reason, you can actually go negative, which is a pretty cool little feature. So the next thing Chowning did after kind of making this first discovery was he realized that you could actually put an envelope onto this LFO, or in this case, it's now an audible oscillator. So let's just call this the modulator. And we see we have our modulation depth here. And so what he did was he took an envelope, which we have right here, and said, okay, let's change how this comes in over time. So I'm going to have my sustain set up to 100 and my attack set up to 100 so we can hear this slowly fade in. Like so. And now we're not using any filter to do this. We just have an envelope, a modulator, and an audible oscillator playing. And that is truly FM in a nutshell. So what I encourage you guys to do is go in here, play around, set up some interesting relationships here. All you need is a calculator, so you could take 220 and multiply it by 3/2 to figure out a nice ratio, or multiply it by 17/19, whatever you want to do, and type in some of those different ranges and see the type of sidebands that you're able to get to come up. Let's just do one other like crazy one. I'm just going to randomly type something in. I want more than that. Oh, it doesn't let me go above 1K. That's disappointing. I mean, technically I can go above 1K. So you can already instantly hear that we're coming up with these sort of complex wave shapes and waveforms that we just couldn't do with the subtractive synthesizer. Hope this has been helpful for you guys. Get in there, mess around with what I've shown you, and you'll hear from me again in the next lesson. Take care.